Well, this video is sure to generate some controversy, but I think it's also necessary and a little fun. Today we're going to talk about what I would say is the last, what I called ultra-reliable Cadillac V8 engine, and that is the 1980 Cadillac 368 cubic inch big block V8. Yes, this is actually a big block V8 engine that displays 368 cubic inches, but more on that later. Now, one may ask, why have I dubbed this the last ultra-reliable Cadillac V8? Well, in 1981, there still was a 368 cubic inch V8, but Cadillac decided to outfit it with cylinder deactivation, the so-called V864 Cadillac engine, where it would start on 8 cylinders and then gradually, as power needs lessened, it would decrease to an imbalanced 6-cylinder mode. And then finally, if you had relatively low power requirements, it would cut down to just 4 cylinders. And while displacement on demand is something that is frequently employed by automakers today in the pursuit of increased fuel economy, back in 1981, it really was novel technology. Nobody else had it. The system was okay, shall we say, but people just weren't used to it. It was not seamless, especially in 6-cylinder mode. And I think it annoyed most people. And in some cases, the setup got stuck in 4-cylinder mode. It also just wasn't a great setup. These had central fuel injection, a throttle body injected setup. They weren't multi-port fuel injection, so they had a wet intake. And you can imagine the issues with shutting down cylinders basically by deactivating the valves. And then in order to reactivate the cylinders, you reactivate the valves, and you got a wet intake with some fuel likely pooling ahead of the valve. It just wasn't something that was optimal. These cars really needed multi-port fuel injection and more advanced electronics to execute that setup correctly. So for that reason, the 1980 variant of the 368 to me is the most ultra-reliable, the last ultra-reliable Cadillac V8. And the 360 cubic inch V8 would only last for 1980 and 1981. In 1979 and 1978, as well as 1977, Cadillac would have a different variant, the 425 cubic inch V8, which was an excellent engine and was relatively small compared to how large this engine became at one point, which was 500 cubic inches. Cadillac had a 500 cubic inch V8 from 1970 to 1976. It started as an Eldorado exclusive in 1970. And then by 1975, it was the standard engine in all Cadillacs. And in 1976, it was the standard engine in all Cadillacs except the Seville, which came standard with Oldsmobile's 350 cubic inch V8, topped with a Cadillac exclusive fuel injection setup. Before 1970, Cadillac had the 472 cubic inch engine, which was introduced for the 1968 model year. And that 472 would continue on through 1974 as well as the standard engine in the non-Eldorado Cadillacs. And prior to that, Cadillac had various V8s, the 390, the 429, but the 472, when it was introduced in 1968, was Cadillac's largest engine, its true big block. And unfortunately, like I said, by 1980 and 81, it became the 368 cubic inch V8. Now, why in the world did Cadillac shrink its V8 from 500 cubic inches at its peak to 368 cubic inches? I think the 368 cubic inch Cadillac V8 would be GM's smallest big block V8 of any that were produced. There were others that were relatively small, but this, I believe, again, was the smallest. Well, corporate average fuel economy standards were dictating that automakers had to achieve 27.5 miles per gallon fleet average, the average fuel economy across their fleet by the mid to late 1980s. And so cars had to shrink as well as engines, and thus the Cadillac 368 was born. Now in 1980, there were multiple variants of this 368 cubic inch V8 in the DeVilles and the limousines. It was a carbureted variant that made 150 horsepower, had a Rochester 4-barrel quadrajet, very reliable carburetor. And then in the Eldorado, the standard engine was this 368 with throttle body fuel injection. It was an open loop system, didn't have an oxygen sensor, I don't believe, but it was a throttle body injected setup. And then the Seville, you could get the same injected V8 as a no-cost engine option because the lovely 5.7-liter 350 cubic inch Oldsmobile V8 diesel was standard in the 1980 Seville. Yes, Cadillac made that abomination standard equipment for 1980 on the Seville only. And the 368, again, was super reliable. It was engineered to be up to a 500 plus cubic inch V8, and here it was stuffed in a car and downsized to the point that it was only 368 cubic inches. It had the GM HEI electronic distributor and electronic ignition, which was relatively reliable, except those lovely modules underneath the rotor and the distributor cap that sometimes fail. But generally, GM HEI setups are reliable. The throttle body injected setup was reliable. The mechanicals were reliable, unlike other GM V8s of the time. These were not cars where you were changing the starters and water pumps all that often. I guess Cadillac must have had different durability requirements because every other GM V8 tended to go through water pumps every 40, 50,000 miles, but not these Cadillac V8s. In fact, I don't think I've ever replaced a water pump on a Cadillac V8, and they're all original and 50 plus years old, and the bearings still have no play, and they cool the car fine. So it's probably better to leave the old original equipment on than buy some cheap aftermarket part and replace it today. On top of that, they were only making 150 horsepower in carbureted form, as I mentioned. The fuel-injected variants actually made less horsepower, 145 horsepower. So they're really understressed engines. They didn't have high red lines. They didn't rev up high. And the blocks also had a high level of nickel content. And that meant that the cylinder bores really didn't wear. You could put a couple 100,000 miles on these engines with no issues and relatively little cylinder wear. So overall, just excellent V8s. And really, any of the Cadillac V8 engines before this were pretty good. Like I said, the 472s, the 500s, the 429s, the 390s were all great engines. And this 368 was, let's just say, of the same lineage. It was a hefty V8. Unfortunately, in 1982, Cadillac would sunset the 368 and replace it by the HT hook and tow, supposedly high technology 4100 digital fuel injection V8. And that engine was an aluminum block engine with cast iron heads. Yes, I said that right. Aluminum block, iron heads, cast iron cylinder liners, and had just considerable issues, and it was woefully underpowered in the cars. It only had a little bit less horsepower than the 368, 135-ish horsepower in most applications. It would be 125 to 135 horsepower throughout its lifetime, depending upon if it were in a front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive application. But it just was not reliable. It had intake gasket issues. It had head gasket issues. It had cylinder wear issues, oil pump issues. Not a good engine overall. Again, Cadillac introduced it in pursuit of fuel economy, really because they had to, not because they wanted to. That engine would last in Cadillacs all the way through 1987. It would actually become a better variant when it was enlarged in 1988 and became the 4.5, and then in 1991 when it became the 4.9. Those are actually pretty good V8s, but the HT 4100 variant is just terrible. And I would still say the 4.5 and the 4.9 are less reliable than the Cadillac 368 from 1980. Then, of course, in 1993, Cadillac would introduce the Northstar V8, which is a lovely engine when it's running correctly. But that engine, many people also relate to, has a number of challenges and issues associated with it. Generally, the cylinder head bolts will kind of pull out of their threads. Then the head gaskets will blow. It'll overheat. You got to have it either helicoiled or the factory correct procedure is with time certs. So not a great engine from an overall reliability standpoint, though I will say pleasingly awesome to drive when they're running correctly. And I actually have never had a head gasket blow in a Northstar that I've owned. I'm not racing them. I always make sure I let them warm up. I change the coolant every couple of years with the GM coolant sealing tabs. And they provided me with good service, good reliable service, I have to say. So I've been happy with my Northstars, but many people had issues with them. And then, of course, you have the more modern engines, which just have a lot of technology associated with them. And while they're great and they have better fuel economy, nothing really beats some of these old school cast iron block, cast iron head, heavy V8 engines. And of course, if you got this in your DeVille, for example, rear-wheel drive DeVille, It was backed with the turbohydromatic 400 transmission. Geez, it doesn't get much better than that. Heavy, durable, reliable. Just doesn't get any better from an overall reliability standpoint. Fuel economy is not that great because you have a 3-speed automatic with no lockup converter. And, well, you had a relatively numerically low rear end ratio in the low 2s. So the engine wasn't turning all that fast, even on the freeway, but still, it was a 3-speed automatic. The 4-speed 204R would come out in 1982 behind the HT4100 and endow those cars at least with good fuel economy. My 84 Seville with the HT4100, I get 24, 25 miles per gallon on the freeway and could even get higher at 26 probably if I really were trying. But that's pretty impressive. But the Cadillac 368 to me is just the best and the last of the breed, and also kind of the last of the GM big blocks and the smallest of them. What do you think? What do you think is GM's last reliable V8 or Cadillac's last ultra reliable V8 engine or engine in general? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.